We are in the book of Matthew again this week. And is anybody surprised by that? We've been in Matthew for quite a while now, but we've been alternating between Exodus and Matthew. And grab the microphone too while you're up there. But we've been working our way through the book of Matthew, and we're actually getting quite far along in the book, and getting to a point where things are starting to develop in the book that have really just been in the context and have been alluded to at this point. Chapter 16 was very, I enjoyed studying it, and I enjoyed trying to figure out what to present here today. It was somewhat challenging, just trying to figure out where this chapter fits in the overall narrative of the book, though. And so whenever I'm preparing or teaching, I try to get at the overall idea, the main overarching theme that is there in the text that we're looking at. And so what I came up with for this one, and perhaps it's fitting for the Christmas season, is the question: are you distracted by the material? We tend to, maybe as a culture, but maybe worldwide, we have kind of materialized the holiday of Christmas. And as soon as Thanksgiving Day is over, we have Black Friday, where people maul each other for DVD players and big screen TVs. What? And VHS tapes, yep. And so we have a preoccupation with things, with material items. And so I think what this section of the book of Matthew is going to highlight for us or illustrate us is that Jesus has been, to this point in the book, preaching about his kingdom and illustrating and showing what that's going to be like, talking to people about what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like, and demonstrating the authority that he has to establish that kingdom. And here, the upshot of what Jesus is going to be teaching is that this kingdom that he is going to establish and that he's going to rule over is not contained or defined by things that are material or earthly. Now, what I mean by material are not actual things like objects, but perhaps characteristics about ourselves. So the upshot of this section here is: are you preoccupied, are you distracted, or are you focused on the material things around you? So with that, we're going to read through the chapter here, and it's 28 verses, which is actually a lot to prep for. So I'm going to break it up, and I'm going to have volunteers read I'm going to have somebody read verses 1 through 12. Then I'm going to have somebody else read verses 13 through 23. Then somebody will close out with verses 24 to 28. Who wants to read the first section? Oh, Rick. Okay. Can we get Rick a microphone? And then who wants to read the second section? Matthew Loudon? All right. So it's your task, my friend. And then who wants to close us out? Boone, you want to close us out? All right, cool. So we'll go Rick, then Matthew Loudon, then Boone. Go ahead, Rick.
The Pharisees and Sadducees came up, and testing Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied to them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given it, except the sign of Jonah." And he left them and went away. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, "Watch out, and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They began to discuss this among themselves, saying, "He said that because we did not bring any bread." But Jesus, aware of this, said, You men of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves that you have no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets full you picked up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets full you picked up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Go ahead, Matthew. What's that?
Where do you want me to stop?
Start verse 13, and you're going to end at the end of verse 23.
All right. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and some Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said to them, But who do you say I am? Simon Peter replied, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, for the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. From the time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get away from me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.
And Boone, lastly, there with the last couple of verses.
Then Jesus told his disciples, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Thank you. Very good. So we start out this chapter with an encounter between Jesus and the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, Stephen taught last time on the second half, or no, you taught the whole chapter 15, right? Just the second half? Because Rick taught the first half of chapter 15, that's right. Okay. Well, in chapters 14 and 15, Jesus does a couple of different things. He feeds 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. That crowd was primarily, if not entirely, Israelites. And so there's this image there of Jesus being the one who's providing this bread or this manna in the wilderness. So there's this image there of God's provision for the children of Israel. And then in the second half, he walks on the water, and I taught on that section where if that's an image of Jesus being the incarnation or the manifestation, if you will, of the Creator God that's referred to in Genesis chapter 1. And then the passage that Stephen taught on, there's a similar account where there's a healing and mass healings and another feeding of thousands of people, but in the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is the area of the Gentiles or the nations. And so there's this picture being painted by Matthew that the blessing of God, the blessings that were originally thought of, or it was thought that was intended only for Israel, is actually going to be brought to all the nations. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that calls back to the Abrahamic promise in Genesis. So that's kind of the context that's being set here, is that Matthew is portraying an idea of what the kingdom or what heaven is going to be like and who is going to be involved in it. And so we start off this chapter after that with these Pharisees and Sadducees coming to Jesus. And what kind of sign do they ask for? A sign from heaven. Okay, and I'll just get to that, the next question. What's ironic about that? Or is there something ironic about that? I need to rephrase my questions so you don't assume that there is something based on how I ask them. So Jesus himself is from heaven, so that's ironic. What else? In the back. Yeah. He's been doing some pretty miraculous stuff, right? That pretty much everybody has at very least has questioned who is this person. And that's been a consistent theme throughout the book of Matthew up until this point as well, is that every time that somebody encounters him, they say, who is this man? Or can this be the son of David? There's questions involved with who he is. Yes, Rick.
There are also people that have had numerous signs in the past from heaven, and they didn't believe.
That's a good point. Yeah. There are people who have had multiple signs, Rick says, from heaven and still have not chosen to believe. And one instance in particular that in this book specifically that comes to my mind is Jesus' baptism. What happens during that event? Anybody remember the phrasing? I know TC knows, but I'm not going to let him answer. I know Rick knows, but I'm not letting him answer either. Spirit descends upon him like a dove. And there's one phrase in there that's, Tristan? What? A voice from heaven called out and said, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." And now I'm going to get it wrong, but yes, thank you, Kendra. Yes, yes, good. The heavens were opened up, and a spirit and a dove descended and landed on Jesus, and then a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." So, the sign from heaven, there's been signs and healings and wonders and all that stuff, but there's been a sign directly from heaven itself already. So the irony that exists here is these Pharisees and these Sadducees are coming to him like, show us a sign from heaven, and acting like that's going to suffice their doubts. Well, that's already been done. There's been sufficient signs given to this point. One other thing that is interesting about this particular part of the text is that, I'll ask you this question. Were the Pharisees and the Sadducees on good terms usually with each other? No. What about them was not congruent, Mater?
Well, they had different schools of thought when it came to
Yeah, they disagreed on doctrinal teachings, right, Levi? Yeah. Yes, the Sadducees rejected the doctrine. The Sadducees rejected the doctrine or the teaching of the resurrection. The Pharisees believed in that. And so usually they were not really that charitable with one another, according to tradition. But here, they're kind of teaming up a little bit, and they're both coming to Jesus and asking him for a sign from heaven. So there's an element that at play here that is going to call back to the parable of the four soils, or the parable of the sower, where you have people responding to who Jesus is this way, this way, this way, and then some of the seed just falls on the pathway, and the birds take it and take it away, and Jesus uses that as a reference to say that the devil snatches it away from them. So there's just no, I don't want to say possibility. There's no taking root of the words of Jesus. And so these Pharisees and these Sadducees have had all the evidence. There's been plenty of signs given to this point. And they're willing to put aside their own little squabble to try and test Jesus into this scenario. And what's supremely, maybe supremely ironic, but what's the highest level of irony that I could pick out with this is that in chapter 15, what Stephen was talking about, with the Canaanite woman and with the group, the 4,000 on the mountain, Jesus seems to be testing their faith. He tests the faith of the Canaanite woman, and then he tests the faith of the crowds out there, and they exhibit great faith, and they persevere in their faith despite being told, go away, or all the harshness of the elements and all that stuff. Their faith perseveres, and throughout that testing, their faith stands. Well, here, those who have no faith and are not trusting come and try to test Jesus. And what does he do? He just shuts them down. He gives them an answer that highlights and addresses their deficiencies, I would say. Because his answer is calling them out and said, you know how to look at the sky and determine what the day is going to be like. You have powers of observation about these things, about earthly things, material things, let's say, but you have no observation. You cannot perceive or understand these heavenly things that I've shown you. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees were just preoccupied or fixated on the material, the physical things about them, their works, their deeds, their ethnicity probably, because they were of the opinion that Israel they are God's chosen people, but that Israel, the blessings of God would only be delivered to Israel. When Matthew has just shown us that they're to all the nations. So this account with the Pharisees and the Sadducees highlights this misjudgment, if you will, of what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like, or what it's going to be defined by, if that makes sense. Any questions on that? Ooh.
What do you think he meant by let no sign be given?
So the question is, what did Jesus mean when he said that no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah, right? Well, this is a good question. And I think this calls back to earlier in the book of Matthew, and I'm not going to remember the reference now. But earlier in the book of Matthew, he says the same thing to 12:39. Thank you, Stephen. So in chapter 12, verse 39, there is an encounter with the Pharisees as well, where he says, they ask for a sign, and he says it's basically the same response as here. In verse 40, Jesus says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And the men of Nineveh will rise up at judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the teaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here." And so I think that this reference, Boone, is a reference back to that. And the sign of Jonah is essentially perhaps a veiled way of Jesus explaining that he's going to die and be buried for 3 days and rise again. I think that's what he's getting at there. And that's going to be a sign given to, everybody's going to be aware of that sign, right? So I think that's what he's referring to there. Good question, though. Yes? Yeah. Do we have microphones we can pass around? Sorry. It's not for me to hear, so it's just for people who are listening online so that they can kind of be aware. But
maybe even adding that, Jonah Jonah had already experienced God. He knew of God. He knew fully who God was and experienced his grace. So when you get to the end of the book of Jonah, how it ends is he's sitting up there and he laments the fact that God has saved these people and he's experienced it. So the sign of Jonah is you Pharisees and Sadducees who have seen the promises of God and have been given the promises of God, you are still blind of the grace of God that bestowed upon whom God chooses.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Any other thoughts on that? You.
Me. So there are a couple interesting things with these first few verses. A lot of times when people think of heaven, they look up to the sky. You know, so when using an example about looking at the sky, it's showing how the Pharisees and Sadducees are really well versed in their knowledge of the Old Testament. So it's kind of ironic that he used that example to say, you guys know it all, but you're overlooking the main point. And when you look at the Old Testament, a lot of it is pointing to Christ. And so he's talking about the sign of Jonas because that's the only thing that his resurrection, after 3 days. And it reminds me of the verse, like, beware of oppositions of science falsely so-called. Because here it's like they know the scriptures, but because they had their own theologies, they were really opposing the scriptures in their knowledge. So it's like, and it all points to Christ, and that's the only sign given to them is of Jonas, because Jonas really portrays Christ and what he was there, and they were going to be firsthand witnesses living in Judea at the same time.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Meyer. Good. Moving, because I do want to get to the rest of this chapter and do it justice. Moving on to the next section, which was, so that's the account with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And okay, they've never gotten it, it seems like. So maybe that's, just chalk it up to that. They're just not going to get it. But then we move on, and Jesus leaves from there with his disciples. And is what you're about to say tied into what we just talked about, or do you need to say it right now? Okay. You'll text me? Okay, good. So Jesus moves on from there. He leaves them, okay? And then he's with his disciples, and they reach the other side of wherever they sailed to, right? And I find this section just funny. So they're traveling, and it highlights the fact that the disciples forgot to bring bread with them. And Jesus assumingly knows this, right? And so he says something to the disciples, and it's tied back to what had just happened with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What was Jesus' words to his disciples in the boat or on the other side here? So, yeah. So he says, beware or watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the disciples, they're just like, dude, we forgot to bring bread. Oh, he's mad. Or whatever their attitude was. It's like that was what they attached onto in that moment, was that Jesus says something about the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they immediately attach onto it being, he's talking about something physical or material and not something perhaps spiritual or eternal or heavenly. So what is the rebuke there from Jesus in verse 8? He just says, "Oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000? So he calls back to these 2 miracles that he did with just a few loaves of bread, and he fed multitudes with it and had some left over. So why would the disciples have a concern with not having any bread? Jesus can make more bread out of just a few loaves and 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So here again, I think we see a callback to the parable of the 4 soils, where you have with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you had the seed that fell on the path and the birds took it. Well, now you have a seed that falls into perhaps soil that it was the rocky soil where it takes root and springs up quickly, but then the cares of the world, cause it to wither away. Now, that's not a full-blown analogy because Jesus explains the parable to them, explains what he means by this, and then in verse 12 that Rick read so emphatically, then they understood that he did not teach them or tell them about the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so, again, we see this preoccupation or this misplaced focus on the things of this world or on the material things as opposed to heavenly things. What time is it? Okay, good. The reason I want to push past that a little bit and not spend too much time there is because this next section, I think, is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And there's a lot of perhaps popular debate on this next section of verses amongst different denominations, and there's plenty of time maybe to get into some of that if we want to, but where I'm going to tie it into is our overall theme of Matthew, the author of this gospel, is highlighting what the kingdom of heaven is not going to be limited to or defined by. Okay? So, that happens with the disciples, and then in verses 13 through 23, there's this instance that happens, or this event, if you will, that happens with Peter. And what, kind of big picture, what happens here? Anybody know? Peter said, go ahead, Rick.
Jesus gets it started. So Jesus gets it started by asking a question: who do people say I am?
Yeah.
And so he gets a report. Then he asks, well, who do you think I am?
Mm-hmm.
And then Peter, I like Peter, opens mouth, inserts foot,
Yeah.
and he made a confession, and there's our story.
Thank you. That's basically what happens. Jesus opens with this question to his disciples, saying, "Who do people say that I am?" And up until this point, there's been varying answers to that, and his disciples answer that question, I would say, accurately. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And Joseph Smith, is that what you said, Rick? You're gonna get in trouble, man. So the disciples offer all of these, or give Jesus all of these answers that people say that Jesus is, right? And again, this is, I think, calling back to the parable of the soils, where you have this array of responses to who Jesus says he is, to the words of truth, to the words of God. There's these varying responses to it. Okay? And then Jesus asks the follow-up question, who do you say that I am? And Peter gives what's called the quote, great confession, right? Which it is. It sounded like I was being facetious there, but it actually is. It's a great confession because he recognizes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. But my question to you is, okay, that's great that Peter did that. There's a lot of doctrine built on this statement of Peter and what follows from it. But I wanted to ask the question, is what Peter did, or is Peter, from doing that, is he way, way, way more special than any of the other disciples in the book of Matthew? Amanda's shaking her head no. TC says yes. Battle it out. Let's go. No, I think TC was being sarcastic, if I'm not mistaken, right? Why do we think he's not more special?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Couple things happen. After the feeding of the 5,000, Peter's the one. He's always the one to go first, right? He's always the one who just, dives right in, which could be a good thing. When they see Jesus on the water, and Peter says, "If it's really you, command me to come out to you." And then so Peter goes out. Then he begins to doubt, and then Jesus saves him. Says, "Why did you doubt?" In this section that we've read here, at the very end, Jesus is talking about his death, what's going to happen, and Peter's like, "No, don't even say that, Lord. That's not going to happen." What does Jesus say to him? "Get behind me, Satan."
Right.
We could think of other things that Peter has done. He's quick to speak. So
Yeah, and now, to be fair, Matthew, the author of the gospel, he does use Peter pretty much exclusively as the spokesman for the disciples. It does all happen after that event with the walking on the water. And I haven't fully fleshed this out yet, but I think it does tie back to that somehow, the reason why Matthew highlights it. But Matthew does utilize Peter in that way throughout the gospel. With this particular instance, though, what is fascinating is how many parallels there are between Peter individually and the disciples as a whole, both in what Jesus says to them and how he responds to them, and the things that happen to them as mentioned in the gospel. So with this particular instance, where I'm going to go with it is I'm going to highlight these two verses that are also in Matthew's gospel, because Jesus says several things to Peter. Well, actually, first of all, let me back up. Peter responds with this confession that Jesus is the Son of the living God and the Christ. And then Jesus says a few things to Peter. So what I want to do is go back and see, is what Peter said, has that never been mentioned before? Has nobody ever caught on to this? Is this the moment in Matthew's gospel where he's making this point? He's like, yes, finally, somebody gets it, right? Well, let's look at chapter 14, which is the walking on the water incident or event. In verse 33, after Peter walks out on the water, Jesus saves him and calls him out, saying, "Why have you a little faith? Why did you doubt?" And they get back in the boat. And in verse 33, they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So the disciples, as a group, collectively, have acknowledged, according to chapter 14, have acknowledged that Jesus is the Son of God. 2 chapters prior to Peter acknowledging it here. Okay? Now, so Peter says that, and then Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. So he says several things to Peter here. First of all, he says that flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Okay? And then second, he tells him that he changes his name, basically. He says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." So then this becomes the point of contention for people, is the rock that Jesus is building his church on. What is the referent, or what does that refer back to? And different schools of thought exist. Some say that the rock is Peter, and then they build onto that a bit of a Catholic doctrine of the papacy, which I don't think holds up, but that's where they go with it. Other people say, and I would say what we would hold to here, is that the rock that Jesus is referring to is the content of what Peter says. This confession, this recognition of who Jesus is And the person of Jesus is that rock upon which the church will be built. Am I getting that right, you guys? Yeah? Okay, good. I got to double check myself. If I get side eyes from TC or Levi, I got to pivot back a little bit. Go ahead.
It's also in church history. I couldn't think of a percentage, but a lot of our church fathers agree. Augustine agreed with that interpretation. That the rock is not Peter, it's his faith.
Yes.
The church is built upon the confession that Jesus is the Son of God, not Peter.
Yeah. It does just so happen in church history that that the interpretation that the rock is Peter was interpreted that way after the papacy was formalized, and also once the papacy kind of got in some like troubled waters, let's say, is when that this kind of became translated that way. So it's not the original interpretation of this text, and it was kind of fit to meet what the Catholic Church was doing at the time, basically, or what they needed to have happen at the time, I suppose. So we would hold to that the rock that Jesus is referring to is the faith that Peter has. Okay, and then thirdly, Jesus tells Peter that I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So that sounds pretty powerful, and that Peter has this power, if you will, to impact heavenly things by what his actions are on earth. And so I would direct your attention to chapter 18, verse 18, where Jesus is now talking to the disciples as a group, and he says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And so he gives his disciples as a group the exact same authority, let's say, or the exact same power, if you will. And so the reason I draw those two things out is you can kind of know what's being said, not by the similarities, but by the differences. So the disciples have all, as a group, have confessed that Jesus is the Son of God. And they are also going to be given the power to bind and loose in heaven. But what is interesting here is what Jesus says to Peter that he doesn't say to the disciples at large, is that flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And so it's not through, I'm going to have to choose my words carefully here. It's not through perhaps the reasoning or the focus on flesh and blood or the material things of this world that the person of Jesus has been revealed to Peter. Okay, God reached out into creation and revealed himself to us. That is how we come to know that Jesus is who he is. The ancient philosophers, they tried to find without using special revelation, let's say, they attempted to find the one, right? The one unifying, or the one thing that truly is or exists, if you will. And the best that they could come up with is just that there's some one thing out there. It's without this revelation from God himself as to who he is and what his plan is, we would not have this knowledge of God. So flesh and blood doesn't. Jesus is highlighting the fact that on your own understanding and reasoning, without God the Father reaching out to you, you would not understand these things. Because I think the core of what this text is talking about, it's not some doctrine to be based on who Peter is or isn't, or what the apostles had in terms of authority or didn't have in terms of authority. I think it's highlighting the fact that the kingdom of heaven that Jesus is proclaiming is not contained by or wrapped around the physical or the things that we would base the kingdom off of. It's not based on those things. Does that make sense? Levi's raising his hand.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what's interesting to me in this text is I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. So you have kind of this kind of warfare imagery being used. The gates of Hades will not overpower it. What's interesting about gates is that gates are defensive structures, right? So it's not Hades attacking the church per se, but it's the church that's, laying siege on Hades.
On the offensive,
And who's in
right.
Hades? Who's going to Hades? Well, anyone who is not in Christ. And Paul writes in Ephesians 6, take up the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Our warfare is with the Word of God. It's the power of God. The gospel is the power of God for those who believe. And so, yes, it's not about the flesh and blood. It's about the things of God and what He's doing. And so, just thought it was interesting, the gates of Hades thing. So.
Yeah, very good. Good. Any other thoughts on that before I move on? Yeah, TC. always with more thoughts.
I think it's interesting. I don't know if there's something more to it, but this was given to Peter first and the other disciples, and I think this power of loosing and binding is the gospel message. The gospel will bound or loose those who either reject it or keep it, or believe it. So it's interesting that Peter got the authority first, and then the other disciples, because it's Peter on the day of Pentecost, and it's his sermon of the gospel that led 3,000 people to give their life to Christ and be baptized.
Yeah. Like I said, man, there's something as to why Matthew uses Peter as the spokesperson. There's something there. I haven't fully understood it yet, but it is interesting. So yeah, Lewis had his hand raised. Yep.
Yeah, I just thought it was kind of cool in Peter's own epistle. In what chapter is it in? Yeah, in chapter 2, he makes it a point to recognize Jesus as the rock or the cornerstone of the church, and then going back to what Levi was talking about that whole battle type of language with the gates of Hades. He also refers to the stone as a rock of offense. So I just thought it was kind of cool that Peter kind of clears that up, I think.
Yeah, that's very good. Levi told me to use that verse in my message, and I told him no. But it sounds like it made its way in anyway, so. Well, good. Because, if Peter himself basically says, I'm not the rock on which the church is built, it kind of refutes that argument to a certain degree, right? And I would say that what we're about to talk about next also would refute that argument as well, because not 5 verses after Peter confesses that Christ is the Son of God, Jesus starts talking about what's going to happen to him as his ministry on earth kind of transitions into his passion, into the passion portion of it. He begins to tell his disciples, and this is the first time that he's explicitly told his disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem, suffer, and die, and all this is going to be done by the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, that he's going to be killed and he's going to rise on the third day. So this is the first time that he's told his disciples this. Now, we're in a section that so far everybody has misunderstood these heavenly things, these spiritual matters, let's say, for physical and material things, right? So what do we think is going to happen next? Are the disciples going to be like, you know what? I bet he's talking about his heavenly kingdom here, right? No. In fact, Peter, the one who just was, elevated, let's say, in the last couple of verses, Peter takes him aside and begins to, what is the word? My Bible says, begin to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And so if Jesus was building let's say, a political kingdom or a kingdom that was going to be based on or contained to, let's say, the things of this world, that would be a terrible thing to happen to the leader of that kingdom, the king of that kingdom. If he was going to be killed, that'd be terrible. So, but that's not what Jesus is doing. And so Jesus just crushes him. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me," or perhaps a stumbling block, or a small stone that trips me. You are a hindrance to me. And this I think, where this section ends is the main point that I think that Matthew, the author, is trying to convey about what Jesus has been, or the narratives that have just happened. The second half of verse 23. "For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." The Pharisees did it, the disciples did it, Peter did it, and Matthew, the author, summarizes all of these narrative accounts in this one phrase that he's using Peter as an example of. He says, "You are setting your mind on the things not on the things of God, but on the things of man." And so here we have and that was Peter's failure in verse 23 there. So here we have this account that's been summarized, and then what happens after this is not more narrative. It's Jesus starts teaching after this for the next for verses 24 to 28. It's actually Jesus teaching his disciples based on these last few narratives, right? And this section of these few verses are actually These few verses are I would say probably very challenging to us in a way, not for us to understand perhaps, but maybe for us to understand how to live out or practice. Okay? And so verses 24 to 28, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you that there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.'" And so, big picture here, I think we tend to, how should I say it? We tend to put the emphasis or put the meaning of certain words in ways that we're kind of trained to do, if that makes sense. So when we read the phrase "losing your life" or "finding your life" or what have you, we typically, at least I do, we tend to equate that or start thinking about more salvation-related topics or ideas. So the question that I have is what Jesus is talking about, is the content of what Jesus is teaching here to his disciples, is it related to salvation or something else? I'm open to answers. I'm not looking for anything. I am looking for something specific, but it can be any answer. And we'll just tell you that you're wrong if it's the wrong answer. What are some thoughts?
Well, I mean, it seems consistent with what you're saying. One pursues the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And try to find your life in those things.
Yep.
There is no life in those things.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
But he's the one.
Yeah. So, very good. So, Levi, to summarize what you're saying there, he's saying that pursuing the things of this world or the things that are material, there's no life in those things. You won't find your life there. You'll find your life in the one who gives life, and that is Jesus. So, what's interesting about these two verses is that it's the same word for life and for soul, but my Bible in the ESV translates the first two times as life and the second two times as soul. But really, you could either translate them this way, or perhaps read them this way. Whoever would save his soul will lose it, but whoever loses his soul for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? Now, I prefer to read it this way. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his life? Or what shall a man give in return for his life? So there's an element here that how we ought to go about conducting ourselves or living is not with a mindset preoccupied with or focused on or, let's say, only limited to the things that are material and physical and things that we can feel, see, hear, all these things, right? There is a heavenly side of things, if you will, or a heavenly mindset, an eternal perspective to be had as we conduct ourselves and go through this life. And the last question there kind of ties into that, is that in the end, what is Christ going to look at? And what are we going to be perhaps known by or judged off of? Is in verse 27. Everybody see it? And he will repay each person according to the things that they have, or their status, or their culture, or their ethnicity, or their whatever, right? No. We will be, he will repay each one according to what he has done. So, if I were to encapsulate that idea, or that section of verses that Jesus is teaching there, I would put it like this. It said, don't be distracted by what the material world elevates, either whether it be power, wealth, gender, race, etc. For none of these things will affect your soul. Instead, take action to draw people closer to the Son of God. And in that, you will find purpose. Your purpose and God's are aligned as we go through this world. And so, we celebrate Christmas this time of year where God came to dwell with man. Emmanuel, God with us. And in his dwelling with us, in that time where Jesus was here with us, he taught a message that turned the world upside down, because what we as humans tend to elevate and find important, and what we think defines us, are these physical things, these material things about us. When really, what will define us and what will be important in the end is what have we done despite our differences and despite our hardships and our conflicts. What have we done despite those things to bring others closer to Christ? I think that's where it gets challenging, because I try to be friendly with people, but I'm not all the time, right? And there are people in my life who at varying times and in varying ways I have upset, or they have been upset with me. And it's very easy to be like, okay, well, I guess we're not going to be friends anymore, or whatever, right? It's always easier to ignore a situation or a problem, or to not prioritize your relationship with that person. But what we are to do is to seek the good for that person, even your enemies. And I think that's where these verses do get challenging for us to put into practice. Yes, Rick, you grab a microphone, perhaps. Lewis has one, I think, and then who has the other microphone? Boone? No? There we go, Levi. I know, they moved around a little bit on us.
Thank you. 60 years ago, there was a young man, a graduate of Wheaton College. He had everything going for him, and he joined with 4 friends and went down to the jungles of Ecuador. And one of the things he said, based on this scripture and other scriptures of discipleship, he is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. That was Jim Elliot, right? Yeah, very good. And I think most people know the story of Jim Elliot, but he paid the ultimate sacrifice in his pursuit of giving the gospel. And yet, he gained rewards that he will have forever in eternity. So, thank you, Rick. Any other thoughts or comments on that? No, I'm not. That's for another time and another place, my friend. Verse 28, those verses, I find them, because there's several other ones like that in Matthew and just in other passages of Scripture. Not that they're not beneficial to study, I'm not saying that. I just find them unsatisfactory anytime I reach a conclusion for it. So he's either talking to just those around him, or he's talking to like an idea, or like the group at large, or whatever. Digging into them requires more time than I think we want to give it, if that makes sense. Is that okay, Levi? Can you teach on it next time? Okay, well, let's close in prayer, and then we'll kind of pack it up here. Our God and our Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for your Son who came to this earth and dwelt among us and taught a message about heaven that is not dependent on what we do or things that we need to give or even our attitude, Lord. We thank you that our position and our destination is secured by his work, and that just by recognizing and trusting in him, that we have peace with God, and that we are bound for eternity with him and with you. We thank you for the people here that make up this body. We just pray that you bless us and keep in our hearts and our minds a heavenly focus and an eternal perspective as we go through our lives and encounter those who may not know you. Pray that we be lights in the darkness, and that we might bring others closer into a sense of trust with you. So we pray these things in your name. Amen.